Hey everybody, this is my second video on learning Maya for beginners. Last time we took a look at the general user interface to understand what Maya was, and now we're going to talk about actually creating some stuff, moving around in this space, and figuring out how to actually manipulate and change objects. So first of all, we need to understand how to move about in this space. So in order to do so, I want to create an object just so that we can actually see it. So I'm just going to use one of the shelf buttons up here, one of these quick options. We'll start with a sphere. So I can just click that. You'll see this gets created. If you're going to tumble, which means you're just spinning around an object, you hold Alt and then left click and drag the mouse. Okay. Next one you need to know is panning. Okay, so this is where we go kind of side to side or up and down in a space. This is Alt and middle mouse click. And then lastly, to zoom in and out is Alt, or dolly is what this is called, Alt and right click. You can also use the scroll wheel and it kind of jumps in. If that's comfortable, you're welcome to do either. But for more precise dollying, you want to use this. Now, another thing that is going to be useful, if you ever find yourself too far away and you just want to get back into the closer space, the hotkey F will frame whatever you have selected. And this also becomes useful when you have multiple objects, because sometimes the pivot of this main camera, so you'll see right now we're just pivoting around this 0, 0, 0 point. But if I were to create another object here, let's just do another sphere and move this over. Even though the other object is selected, I'm still pivoting here, which can get a little bit frustrating. So if I use F, I've now jumped to the other sphere and I'm using its main pivot point as my pivot point. Now by default, I had my move tool on, so I pressed Q to turn that off. So we kind of talked about those in the last video, but we have our move. Well, this is our default selector tool, and then we have move, rotate, and scale. So we move things, we rotate things, and we scale things. I just use hotkeys for these because that ends up being more convenient. But I want to help understand what that actually is doing before we even use these. So I've got my channel box open, and you'll see that it has translate X, Y, and Z, and rotate X, Y, and Z, scale X, Y, and Z. So this is basically what's happening to the object. And they're all set to zeros right now, except for the scale. The default is 1. But you'll see if I change any of these, like the scale X, if I jump to 2, it pulled this out in the X direction 2 units. Okay, so each of these on the grid represents 1 unit right now. And you can change these so that these, are in inches or centimeters, millimeters, whatever you need this to be. If you're going to 3D print an object, you can switch that around. Okay, so if I, for example, go to translate X and I type in 1, you'll see that this jumped over. I'm just going to type in 5. You'll see this now jumps over to this point. So all of these are going to tell this object exactly what is happening. So we're going to do this in real time now with these controls. So W is your hotkey for movement, and you'll see that selects this tool. So I generally like to start moving specific to each axis. So you can grab the arrow that you want to move, and it will only move in that direction. So it's not going to accidentally move anywhere else. You'll see that you have these floating kind of boxes. This means it will move only in 2 directions. So this one will lock it to the X and to the Y. So you'll see I can move it around, but no matter where I go, it's going to stay in that kind of area. You also have an option to move things around freely with the dead center. This just be a little bit careful with, because it's hard to tell what you're actually doing. So I might grab this and move this up and assume that I've successfully done this. But when I'm spinning around, you'll see I also moved this back a little bit. And sometimes it gets even more confusing. You might move it over here and think you know where it is, and then you start spinning around and it's not exactly where you were expecting. So it's just good to kind of make sure you're keeping track of where things are moving. So the next thing is E for our next hotkey. E is for our rotate. Same thing, I like to grab the actual handles here to rotate specifically. So you'll see as I'm rotating this, over here in my rotate Z, we get an actual movement of what's happening. It's going to tell us whether this is in the negative or the positive. And I can be more specific. If I want this to go exactly 90 degrees, I could go type this. I'm using my undo Control Z if I haven't gone over that hotkey yet, just to jump back. Okay. This one also has a free rotate. I do not use that very often early on when modeling. I do use that more often in the animation process just to get more fluid control over the movements that you're doing. So the last one, R, this is going to be our scale tool. So once again, grabbing any of these will scale in a particular direction. The center is the one I do use the most on this one because it just scales everything uniformly, and you'll see that all three numbers change when I do this. So one thing that I like to have students do when they first start playing around with these manipulators is to just move things around and practice with this. So I'll say, create a cube and then move it somewhere and then scale it a bit and then create, a cylinder, and now put the cylinder on top of the cube. And so they'll practice kind of moving this around and getting this where it needs to go. And they'll quickly learn that this can be a little bit tricky, especially if I'm not clicking the right thing. But you'll see I've got the cylinder. It's hard to know exactly where you are. I might think I'm in the center, but it can be tricky to actually get that right. So once again, this is when you want to jump into your other views, your orthographic. So if I tap spacebar, I showed this in the last video, you'll see these 4 different views, or you can access them right here. This gives us our top view, our front and side. So now if I'm looking at these, I can get a little bit better idea over what this is actually doing and try to get this placed correct. And this can be just a faster way to place things. Now there is more specific ways that you can do this that you really can control exactly where they're ending up. So I'm going to just undo some of these. In fact, we'll just start with a box here, and I'm going to make this box bigger. So real quick, I want to look at our snapping options. So up at the top, we've got these magnets, and these can be very useful. So the snap to grid, let's just turn that one on so you see what happens. We get kind of a circle here, so it's going to snap that circle according to where we're moving this on the grid. So if I'm moving this over, you'll see this goes over 1 and just snaps into these positions. What's tricky about this is the manipulator is the center of this object. So if I wanted to snap the base of the object to the bottom of the grid here, it gets a little bit tricky to do unless you move this manipulator, which actually is pretty easy to do. So if you tap D, then you get this manipulator tool that you can actually move. So if I move this down, for example, and I tap D again to go back to the basics, if I were to rotate, this now rotates around that new pivot point. Okay, but how this can be particularly useful is I can snap this into different spots. So we can use these again, and it's pretty useful to use some of the hotkeys. So if I press X on my keyboard, you'll see that this lights up, and then when I let go, it turns off. This is just the hotkey to snap to a grid. So with D selected, so my regular manipulator tool, I press D so I can move the pivot point, and if I hold X and bring this down, I can snap this to the grid, or if I use V, I can snap this to a point. So you'll see that this is now snapping to the top of my box or the bottom of my box. And what it's doing is it's looking at where the vertex points are that it can snap to. So now that I have this snapped to the bottom, I can press D again. Pivot point is where I want, so I've pressed W to access the move tool. I can do X to snap to grid. Should not have grabbed that in the center, and I'll just move this up. So because I grabbed it in the center, it was trying to snap to a grid point over here, which is why that kind of freaked out. And it's stuff like that in Maya that you'll do all the time, and it's just fun. So now that I have this moved where I want this, how do I get this pivot point back to the center? Luckily, that's very easy. We just go up here to modify, and there's a nice little center pivot button, and that will just kind of reset this into the center of the object. So snapping becomes really great if you're going to line things up. If I were to create another cube right now, and try to lift this up and guess where this is going to be sitting properly on the bigger box, it can be a little bit tricky because I'm trying to eyeball it. I can go into the other views and make sure I'm sort of where I'm supposed to be. But to make sure that I'm really doing this exactly as I want, I can press D. We'll snap this to a point. Yep, we'll go there. And now with D again, I can move this up or down. But once again, if I'm holding V to snap to a point, I can get this to snap to basically the face of this bigger box. And now I know this is where I want this to be. Modify, center pivot, get that reset. And now I have this exactly in place, exactly aligned with the other one, if that's what you're going for. So I'm going to delete this cube because the next thing we want to look at is how to actually change these objects. Because we can create these different objects, which is one thing, but changing them is going to be necessary to get actual models that look appealing. So we have different components that we can access to change around. If I hold right click over an object, you'll see I have these options, and I'm holding my right click button. I'm not letting it go or pressing it once. I have edge, vertex, and face. And object mode is good. Object mode is our default, so I can ignore some of these others, you know, like UV, and you saw me kind of do this when you jump into one that has an arrow. The way to get back to your other ones is just hover over this little circle. But let's start with face. If I let go over face, I now can select the individual faces on this cube. And if I were to move this, you'll see it just moves that face where it needs to go. Or I could rotate this face, or I could scale this face. And now I'm starting to get more control over what I'm doing with this object. Okay, hold right click over the object again. Next is edge. This allows me to select individual edges, and same thing. We can move these around, we can scale these, and do whatever we need to. Okay, rotate as well. Last one is vertex, which gives me these individual points. Now, scaling an individual point, rotating an individual point, that's not going to do anything. You can still move an individual point. It's going to do some weird things to this face, but honestly, what most people do with vertices is they use the marquee select to get multiple vertices. So if I grab these two vertices, you may guess that this is going to do exactly the same thing as if I selected the edge. And this can be nice if you're just hopping around, you know, in vertices, because now I can just pick all four of these, and now I have the face selected. So I tend to be the type when I'm modeling that I'm in vertex mode a lot, because I can just drag what I want, and I don't have to select back between edge mode or face mode quite as often. I still use those modes all the time, but I tend to find myself in vertex mode, honestly, quite a lot. So that's kind of a quick overview of how you're working with objects. One thing I want to point out really fast before we go, I used these so far, which are just in the shelf. So these are kind of my quick access buttons, but these don't actually have all the options available. So I have a lot of students who start using these and they get stuck only using these. Just so you know where these are in the main menu, you go up to create, and then they're polygon primitives. There's some other primitives that are options and can be used for other things that I can get into later, but for polygons, you'll see we have the sphere, cube, cylinder, but a lot of these, you know, things like the pipe is actually really useful. The pipe, let's just get rid of this, is a cylinder but already has a hole cut into the center. I find myself using this one all the time, but you'll see it's not up here in one of my options. You can, of course, get it to be one of your options if you're using it all the time, but that's just one that I find useful that isn't available immediately. So it's sometimes useful to look over at these different menu options to make sure you're getting what you want instead of only relying on some of the options that they've given you in this quick access. And the last thing that I want to go over today is selecting things. So if I'm in face mode and I wanted to select all of these, if I select one and shift select one next to it, it will try to get the ring around it. Double clicking on one is going to select a little bit more. Sometimes it selects a little bit differently than like a whole object, but this is a very convenient way to get bigger selections. The next option, so you can always drag select things. With face mode, this is going to be a little bit weird because you'll see that when you drag the top, you also drag anything through to the side and the bottom. So I have students all the time who accidentally select faces they don't mean to. Sometimes they're just trying to one at a time select options, and they accidentally click and drag on one, and then they've got something selected down here that's going to cause problems later. So just so you know how I did that in the first place, holding Shift allows you to just get one more at a time. And then when you double click on one, that's what gets kind of the whole ring of something. And we can do this going around this way too. So I selected this one first and then double clicked on this one, and now we get that loop that goes around. But we can all just go around and hold Shift to select different things. Okay. One of the problems with this, if I go into, let's do vertex mode. Okay. Maybe I grab, let's grab too much. Well, let's just grab these. Okay. So I've grabbed some of the bottom ones here. And maybe I wanted to deselect some of these bottom ones. So I can hold Shift, and then I click and drag to deselect them. But if you noticed, I actually just selected these two now. Okay, and if I hold Shift again, I'm going to drag over these two. You'll see that they kind of swap. So now that one's selected, but that one's deselected. So sometimes what's useful is using the Control and Shift option. Control and Shift will allow you to just grab more without deselecting anything. And this can be so useful when you're really in any of these modes. You know, if I wanted to grab these and decided that I also needed to grab some more in the middle, if I was just trying to use Shift to grab some more in the middle, you'll see it's going to deselect some of them. However, if I hold Control and Shift to grab some in the middle, it just adds them to my selection, which is really nice. Other selection options. Okay, this one here allows you to grab in a loop. I find this most useful for vertex mode. So let's just click away from here. If I just wanted to get really weird specific vertices, you can do it with this. And lastly, you have the paint brush. I'll use this one in face mode. This one just kind of lets you paint over certain areas to select. So anytime you have a brush like this, if you hold B and click and drag, this is how you change your brush size. So change this a little bit smaller, and then I can just paint around here and easily select these. The one good thing about this mode, it does not select through the object, so you'll see it doesn't grab any of the back faces, and can be kind of a quick way to select things. And the other good thing is it's kind of always in the Control Shift mode, so I don't accidentally deselect things by trying to select more. Okay, so just some options to select these and start manipulating and moving those around. Hopefully this was helpful. This is just a first look. We're going to get into more tools on how to change and manipulate these to get models that actually look nice, but that's what is good to learn today. I would go practice, open up Maya, move things around, get used to it. It's a little bit weird at first when you're not used to 3D, but a little practice and you'll be good to go.